February 29th, 2012. Huntsville, Texas. Rain falls lightly. Against the walls of the Huntsville unit as reporters, beneath light floodlights outside one of the most feared execution chambers in America. Inside the prison, 41-year-old George Rivas sits alone in a small holding cell just feet away from the room where Texas is preparing to kill him. The guards move quietly tonight. No one inside the building needs to be reminded who he is. More than a decade earlier, his name had spread across the entire country, alongside 6 other escaped convicts who became known as the Texas Seven. Together, they pulled off one of the most infamous prison escapes in modern American history. They vanished from a South Texas prison without firing a shot, stole weapons, disappeared across state lines, and triggered a nationwide manhunt that dominated headlines for weeks. But the moment Texas never forgot came on Christmas Eve in the year 2000, when Irving police officer Aubrey Hawkins answered a suspicious activity call at a sporting goods store and drove straight into an ambush. 11 bullets tore through his body before he could even draw his weapon. His wife and 9-year-old son were still waiting for him to return to dinner. That murder changed everything. The escape stopped being a prison story and became something darker. One by one, the Texas Seven would eventually fall. Some were executed. One killed himself before police could take him alive. Now only George Rivas remains. In less than an hour, the man prosecutors called the mastermind will be strapped to a gurney as the state of Texas closes the final chapter of a story that began years earlier inside a prison where 7 violent inmates quietly started planning their escape from hell. George Angel Rivas Jr. was born on May 6, 1970, in El Paso, Texas, a border city where violence, poverty, and survival often lived side by side. From the outside, his early life did not immediately point toward the kind of future waiting for him. He grew up around working-class neighborhoods filled with auto shops, small apartment buildings, liquor stores, and the constant sound of traffic drifting north from the border. People who knew him as a teenager would later describe him as quiet but intense, the kind of person who always seemed to be measuring the room around him. He was not loud. He was not reckless in obvious ways. But there was something controlled about him, something simmering beneath the surface that made people pay attention when he spoke. By the time he was in his late teens, Rivas had already started drifting into armed robberies and street crime. Money mattered, but power mattered more. He liked the feeling of control that came with a gun in his hand and fear in someone else's eyes. The robberies became more violent over time, and so did his reputation. In 1987, at just 17 years old, he was convicted of burglary. That sentence was only the beginning. Over the next several years, arrests stacked on top of each other: aggravated robbery, attempted murder, escape attempts, assaults. Every time the state locked him away, he came back more dangerous than before. Prison did not humble George Rivas. It sharpened him. Inside the Texas prison system, survival depended on posture, reputation, and the ability to project strength without constantly using violence. Rivas understood that quickly. He learned how officers moved, how inmates formed alliances, and how fear could travel through a prison block faster than fists ever could. Men listened to him because he carried himself with certainty. Even older inmates noticed it. He rarely raised his voice, but conversations seemed to shift around him naturally, as if everyone understood he needed to be taken seriously. By the late 1990s, Rivas had accumulated multiple lengthy sentences that effectively guaranteed he would spend most of his life behind bars. Transfers moved him through different Texas units until he eventually arrived at the Connolly unit in Kennedy, South Texas. The prison sat isolated beneath brutal heat and endless stretches of flat land. Razor wire lined the fences. Guard towers overlooked concrete yards where inmates spent their days pacing beneath the sun like trapped animals. Inside the cell blocks, routines repeated endlessly: counts, meals, searches, lockdowns. Days blurred together until time itself barely felt real anymore. But something dangerous was beginning to grow inside Connolly. Rivas had started gathering attention from a small circle of violent inmates who shared one thing in common. None of them intended to die in prison quietly. They talked during recreation, in hallways, in maintenance areas away from officers. At first, the conversations sounded like fantasies every prisoner eventually entertains. Escape stories, weak spots, security failures. But with Rivas, the discussion slowly became more serious. Because unlike the others, George Rivas did not talk about freedom like it was a dream. He talked about it like it was a plan. And before long, he began studying the prison itself with a level of patience that should have terrified everyone around him. By the year 2000, the Connolly unit held more than just violent inmates. It held men who had already accepted that society would never allow them back into the world. Some were serving life sentences. Others carried decades stacked so high that freedom had become something abstract, almost mythical. Inside those concrete walls, hopelessness settled into people slowly. Some inmates broke under it. Others disappeared into routine. But a smaller group became something more dangerous. They stopped fearing consequences altogether. George Rivas understood that kind of man better than anyone. The inmates who eventually became known as the Texas Seven did not arrive together. They came from different cities, different backgrounds, different crimes. What connected them was violence, desperation, and the growing belief that prison had already taken everything from them except the ability to fight back. Michael Rodriguez was one of the most feared among them. Even inside prison, his reputation carried weight. He had been sentenced to death for murdering a woman during a robbery in San Antonio years earlier. Officers watched him carefully because violence seemed to live close beneath his skin. Other inmates described him as unpredictable, intense, and deeply religious in strange bursts that never fully hid his brutality. He could quote scripture one moment and threaten someone the next. Rivas saw something useful in him immediately: aggression without hesitation. Then there was Randy Halprin, smaller and quieter than the others, but no less dangerous. Before prison, he had been involved in a string of violent robberies connected to a drug-fueled crime spree that ended with a police officer dead. Halprin carried himself differently inside Connolly. Nervous energy clung to him. He laughed at inappropriate moments, paced constantly during recreation, and often looked like someone trying to outrun his own thoughts. But beneath that anxious exterior was a man fully capable of violence when cornered. Patrick Murphy stood out for different reasons. Born in Ireland, he spoke with an accent that made him instantly recognizable among Texas inmates. Before arriving at Connolly, he had murdered a man during a brutal confrontation connected to drugs and robbery. Murphy could be charming when he wanted to be. Guards sometimes described him as respectful compared to other violent offenders. But inmates who spent enough time around him understood the performance underneath. He adapted to people quickly, changing personalities depending on who stood in front of him. Donald Newberry had already spent years building a reputation as a hardened robber with little regard for human life. He had been convicted after a violent crime spree involving stolen vehicles, armed robbery, and murder. In prison, he rarely wasted words. He watched people carefully, spoke when necessary, and carried himself like someone permanently preparing for confrontation. Younger inmates avoided testing him because they knew his history. Violence had followed Newberry long before prison found him. Larry Harper was older than most of the others, but prison had not softened him. He had a long criminal history stretching back years, including burglary, armed robbery, and violent assaults. Harper understood systems. He understood routines. More importantly, he understood pressure. Long prison sentences had hollowed him out emotionally until survival became the only thing that mattered. By the time he met Rivas, he had already reached the point where dying during an escape sounded better than growing old behind bars. Joseph Garcia completed the group. He had been convicted of murder during a robbery in South Texas, and prison records described him as dangerous but disciplined. Garcia rarely caused unnecessary attention inside Connolly. Officers sometimes underestimated him because he appeared calmer than the others, but inmates knew better. Men like Garcia were often the most dangerous of all, patient, observant, and willing to follow violence wherever it led. At first, the 7 men circled each other cautiously. Conversations happened during maintenance, work assignments, recreation periods, and moments when officers were distracted by routine. Nothing about the early discussions sounded extraordinary. In prison, inmates constantly talked about escape fantasies, weak gates, blind spots, guard habits. Most of it meant nothing. Most prisoners were simply trying to survive boredom. But George Rivas approached the subject differently. He asked specific questions. Which civilian supervisors carried radios? How long did shift changes overlap? Which maintenance doors stayed unlocked during work hours? Which officers grew lazy near lunchtime? The others slowly realized he was not daydreaming. He was studying the prison like a blueprint. Inside Connolly, daily life followed rigid patterns. Laundry carts rolled through corridors at nearly identical times every day. Civilian maintenance workers moved through restricted areas with less supervision than correctional officers. Tool rooms opened and closed on schedules inmates quietly memorized. Most guards relied on routine because routine made prison manageable. But routine also created weakness. Rivas began pulling the group closer together piece by piece, not through speeches, not through threats, through confidence. He made freedom sound practical, possible. That was the dangerous part. Late at night inside cramped cells, the conversations became more serious. The men discussed weapons, vehicles, hostages, and what would happen if officers resisted. Nobody inside that group believed the escape could happen peacefully forever. Too many of them were already convicted killers. Too many had spent years surviving through intimidation and violence. The possibility of bloodshed was never far from the surface, and yet the idea kept growing. 7 men, one plan, one chance to disappear before Texas realized what had happened. By the fall of 2000, the escape was no longer fantasy. The group had started assigning responsibilities. One inmate would control civilian workers. Another would gather clothing. Another would secure weapons if they reached the armory. They rehearsed movements mentally, over and over, timing how long certain corridors remained empty and how quickly alarms could spread through the unit. Every detail mattered because failure would mean death. The prison itself seemed unaware of what was forming inside its walls. Officers still walked corridors casually. Civilian employees laughed during lunch breaks. Towers overlooked fences baking beneath the South Texas sun. The routines never changed. But hidden beneath those routines, 7 violent inmates were quietly preparing to vanish. And once the planning reached that point, there was no turning back anymore. December 13th, 2000. began like every other afternoon. Inmates lined up for lunch beneath the dull hum of fluorescent lights. Beyond the razor wire, flat South Texas land stretched endlessly beneath a gray winter sky. Nothing about the prison looked unusual. That was exactly how George Rivas wanted it. For months, the 7 inmates had studied routines inside the unit until they practically knew the prison better than some of the guards working there. They knew which civilian supervisors were careless. They knew when certain hallways emptied during lunch rotations. They knew how long it took for alarms to spread from one section of the prison to another. Every weakness had been memorized. Shortly before noon, the plan finally began. The first target was a civilian maintenance supervisor named Ralph Aguilar. He had no weapon, no reason to suspect danger, and no idea 7 violent inmates had spent months preparing for this exact moment. As Aguilar entered the maintenance area, one of the inmates distracted him while the others closed in fast. Within seconds, he was overpowered, shoved to the ground, and restrained. The speed mattered. No screaming, no hesitation. The moment Aguilar lost control, the prison itself started slipping out of control with him. One by one, correctional officers and civilian workers entering the area were ambushed before they understood what was happening. Some were beaten. Others were tied up with electrical cords and duct tape. Radios were taken immediately to stop distress calls from spreading too quickly. The inmates moved with terrifying coordination, almost military, in the way each man handled his role. George Rivas stayed calm through all of it. Witnesses later described him as focused, issuing instructions while the others carried them out around him. There was chaos unfolding inside Connolly, but it was controlled chaos. Every movement had already been rehearsed mentally dozens of times. Within minutes, the group had stolen correctional uniforms and prison employee clothing. Guards were stripped of belts, keys, radios, and identification. Some hostages were locked inside utility rooms while others were forced face down onto floors, listening helplessly as the escape unfolded around them. Then the situation became even more dangerous. The group breached the prison armory. Inside were rifles, pistols, ammunition, and tactical equipment. For a brief moment, the inmates had access to enough firepower to turn the prison into a massacre if they chose to. Officers trapped elsewhere inside the unit had no clear idea how many weapons the escapees now possessed. Fear spread quickly through the facility. The realization hit all at once. These were not inmates trying to sneak out quietly. These were heavily armed, violent offenders preparing for open escape. Outside the prison walls, employees still moved through parking areas, unaware of what was happening inside. Then came the final step. Using a stolen state maintenance truck, the 7 inmates drove directly out of the Connolly unit through the prison gates. Dressed in stolen uniforms, carrying stolen weapons, they passed through security before the full emergency lockdown could take hold. By the time officers realized the truck leaving the facility was part of the escape, it was already gone. Just like that, 7 violent inmates disappeared into South Texas. Inside the maintenance area, investigators later discovered a handwritten message left behind for authorities. "You haven't heard the last of us yet." The words felt less like a joke and more like a warning. Within hours, roadblocks spread across Texas highways. State troopers flooded surrounding counties. News stations interrupted regular programming with emergency bulletins showing the faces of the escaped convicts. The FBI joined the search almost immediately. Helicopters scanned fields and highways, while prison officials faced a horrifying reality few thought possible. 7 dangerous inmates had escaped one of the largest prison systems in America, and nobody knew where they were going next. Within hours of the escape, the faces of the 7 inmates were everywhere. Television stations interrupted afternoon programming with breaking news bulletins. Newspapers rushed out emergency editions. Across Texas, gas stations and grocery stores taped printed photographs of the escapees onto windows and bulletin boards. George Rivas stared out from television screens beside 6 other hardened criminals, now being described as some of the most dangerous fugitives in America, the Texas 7. The name spread fast because it sounded larger than life, almost cinematic. But there was nothing cinematic about the fear moving through law enforcement circles. These were not desperate teenagers or nonviolent offenders. Several of the escapees were convicted murderers. Others had histories filled with armed robbery, assaults, and escape attempts. Now they were loose, heavily armed, and moving somewhere across the country with nothing left to lose. For the first few days, the group stayed inside Texas, moving carefully between stolen vehicles and cheap motels. They slept in cramped rooms beneath fake names, curtains closed tightly against parking lot lights. Every television became both a weapon and a threat. They watched the news obsessively, studying police briefings and manhunt updates while hearing their own names repeated by anchors across America. George Rivas controlled most of the decisions. Witnesses later said the group operated almost like a moving prison unit, Rivas naturally taking command while the others followed his lead. He decided when they moved, where they stayed, and who spoke during encounters with strangers. Even outside prison walls, the structure remained the same. At first, freedom felt intoxicating. No counts, no locked cells, no officers screaming orders through steel bars. For the first time in years, they could drive where they wanted, stop where they wanted, eat what they wanted. Some of them laughed more openly than they had inside prison. Others stared silently out motel windows at ordinary people living ordinary lives, people who had no idea 7. The escaped convicts were sleeping 20 feet away, but the freedom was fragile. Every police siren became a possible threat. Every knock at a motel door tightened nerves instantly. They changed appearances constantly, shaving facial hair, wearing caps, sunglasses, and oversized clothing. Some posed as construction workers. Others pretended to be traveling laborers moving between jobs. Then came one of the strangest parts of the story. At different points during the manhunt, the fugitives attempted to blend into religious communities by presenting themselves as Christian men trying to rebuild their lives. They attended church services, carried Bibles, and spoke politely with people they met along the way. In some towns, locals later admitted the men seemed respectful, even friendly. Nobody realized they were sharing conversations and meals with some of the most wanted fugitives in America. But beneath the disguises, pressure kept building. Money disappeared quickly. Hotel rooms, food, fuel, weapons, and stolen vehicles all cost something. The group needed cash constantly, and legitimate work was impossible with every law enforcement agency in the country searching for them. The FBI circulated updated fugitive bulletins nationwide, while Texas Rangers tracked possible sightings across multiple states. Tips flooded police hotlines daily. Some were useless. Others came dangerously close. On December 21st, the group robbed a Radio Shack store near Pearland, Texas. The robbery itself was fast and controlled. Employees were threatened and restrained, while the fugitives stole cash and electronics before disappearing again. But the crime showed something important. The pressure was already affecting them. Staying hidden required money, and money required risk. By then, the manhunt had become national news. America's Most Wanted aired segments about the fugitives. Police departments across the country received warnings to treat every member of the Texas 7 as armed and extremely dangerous. Families watched evening news reports showing sketches, surveillance photos, and criminal histories, while reporters debated where the men might strike next. And somewhere beneath all the fear and adrenaline, the group started changing psychologically. The illusion of permanent escape began fading. The reality was unavoidable now. They could not keep running forever. Some members became quieter. Others grew more paranoid. Conversations turned tense more easily inside motel rooms. Arguments surfaced over money, movement, and risk. They were no longer just escaping prison. They were trying to outrun an entire country. Then Christmas Eve arrived, and with it came the decision that would seal all of their fates forever. December 24th, 2000, Irving, Texas. The city glowed beneath Christmas lights and cold winter air as families made final preparations for the holiday. Restaurants were crowded. Parking lots stayed busy late into the evening with shoppers carrying wrapped gifts through storefront doors. Inside homes across the city, children fought sleep, knowing Christmas morning was only hours away. Officer Aubrey Hawkins spent that evening with his family. He was 29 years old, a husband, a father, and an Irving police officer who had been with the department just over a year. Friends described him as dependable and calm, the kind of officer people trusted immediately. But outside the uniform, he was known most for how deeply he loved his family, especially his 9-year-old son, Andrew. That night, Aubrey sat inside a restaurant with his wife, Lori, his son, his mother, and grandmother finishing dinner together on Christmas Eve. Then his police radio crackled. A suspicious activity call had come in from an Oshman's sporting goods store less than a mile away. Inside the store, the Texas Seven were already moving. The group had entered the sporting goods store shortly before closing time. Employees were rounded up quickly, forced onto the floor, and tied up while the fugitives stole dozens of firearms, ammunition, cash, and police equipment. One of the escapees stood lookout outside, monitoring traffic and police movement while the others loaded stolen weapons into vehicles. Aubrey Hawkins had no idea who he was driving toward. He simply stood from the dinner table, told his family he would be back soon, and walked out into the cold December night. It would be the last time they ever saw him alive. At approximately 6:45 p.m., Hawkins arrived behind the Oshman's store near the loading dock area. His patrol car rolled slowly into the parking lot as one of the fugitives spotted the headlights and immediately warned the others through a radio. Police. The reaction inside the store was instant. The men grabbed weapons and rushed toward the back exit before Hawkins even had time to fully understand what he was facing. Investigators later determined the attack happened with terrifying speed. The moment Hawkins stopped his patrol car, gunfire. Hawkins never truly had a chance to defend himself. The parking lot became chaos. Glass shattered across the pavement. Gunfire echoed behind the store while terrified employees remained bound inside, listening helplessly. George Rivas himself was wounded during the exchange, struck in the arm by return fire or friendly fire during the ambush. But even injured, the group kept moving. Then came the moment investigators and Hawkins' family would never forget. As the fugitives fled the scene, in a stolen Ford Explorer, the vehicle ran directly over Aubrey Hawkins' body, dragging him across the pavement before speeding into the night. By the time backup officers arrived, the scene looked catastrophic. An Irving police officer lay bleeding heavily beside his destroyed patrol car on Christmas Eve, while the men responsible vanished into the darkness, carrying stolen weapons and ammunition. Hawkins was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas. Doctors fought to save him, but the damage was too severe. Surrounded by hospital staff and devastated family members, Aubrey Hawkins died later that night. He was 29 years old. His son Andrew was still waiting for his father to come home for Christmas. The murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins changed everything. Before Christmas Eve, the Texas Seven were dangerous fugitives. After the shooting in Irving, they became national enemies. The escape was no longer being discussed as a shocking prison break. Now it was a police murder case tied to 7 armed convicts moving somewhere across America with stolen weapons in their possession. Texas exploded with outrage. News stations replayed the story constantly. A young officer ambushed and killed on Christmas Eve while responding alone to a suspicious activity call. Aubrey Hawkins' photograph appeared beside images of his wife and 9-year-old son, turning the case into something deeply personal for people across the country. Police departments lowered flags. Officers attended memorials in silence. Law enforcement agencies that had once treated the fugitives as escapees now hunted them like a mobile war zone. The reward money climbed rapidly. State agencies, private donors, and organizations added more money to the capture fund until hundreds of thousands of dollars were being offered for information. Tips flooded in from nearly every state. Sightings were reported at gas stations, motels, campgrounds, truck stops, and restaurants. Most were false alarms, but authorities kept tightening the search. Then America's Most Wanted aired the case nationally. The episode transformed the manhunt overnight. Millions of viewers watched reenactments of the prison escape and the murder of Officer Hawkins, while the faces of George Rivas and the others filled television screens across the country. Suddenly, hiding became almost impossible. The fugitives could no longer assume anonymity in public places. Any cashier, waitress, or motel clerk might recognize them at any moment. By then, the group had made its way to Colorado. The 7 men settled temporarily inside an RV park near Woodland Park, just west of Colorado Springs, hiding among snow-covered mountains and quiet winter roads. They rented a motorhome using fake identities and attempted to blend into the transient atmosphere of the campground. On the surface, it almost looked peaceful. Pine trees surrounded the area. Snow rested along the ground. Families vacationed nearby without realizing 7 fugitives were living only yards away. But inside the RV, the pressure was crushing them. Weeks of fear, sleeplessness, and constant paranoia had started breaking the group psychologically. The illusion of freedom that once energized them was disappearing fast. Every passing police cruiser triggered panic. Helicopters overhead made conversations stop instantly. Curtains stayed shut most of the time, as the fugitives smoked cigarettes, watched news coverage, and argued quietly about what came next. The fractures inside the group became harder to hide. Some still believed they could escape permanently, maybe into Mexico or farther north. Others already understood the truth. The country was closing around them. There were too many faces on television, too many officers searching, too much pressure. George Rivas tried maintaining control, but even he could feel the collapse beginning. It came the tip that changed everything. A couple visiting the RV park recognized the fugitives after watching America's Most Wanted. Suspicious of the men staying inside the motorhome, they contacted authorities. Investigators moved carefully, verifying details before acting. Once they confirmed the identities, hundreds of law enforcement officers quietly mobilized around the campground. By January 21, 2001, the Texas Seven were surrounded, and for the first time since escaping Connolly Unit, there was nowhere left to run. The morning air around the RV park was freezing cold. Snow covered parts of the ground as armored vehicles, SWAT teams, FBI agents, and sheriff's deputies slowly sealed off the area surrounding the motorhome where the Texas 7 were hiding. Officers moved into position carefully, rifles trained toward the RV, while nearby residents were evacuated quietly to avoid panic. Inside the motorhome, the fugitives already knew something was wrong. Some had seen movement outside. Others heard helicopters overhead and police radios crackling faintly in the distance. The atmosphere inside turned heavy almost instantly. Weeks of paranoia had finally become reality. The manhunt was over. Authorities used loudspeakers to call for surrender, warning the fugitives the area was completely surrounded. Negotiators attempted to keep the situation calm because everyone understood the danger inside that RV. 7 heavily armed convicts, with nothing left to lose, could easily turn the standoff into a massacre. For hours, tension hung over the campground. Then one gunshot shattered the silence inside the motorhome. Larry Harper had taken his own life. Investigators later determined Harper shot himself rather than return to prison. After surviving the escape, the robbery, and the nationwide manhunt, he chose suicide over capture. His death seemed to break whatever fantasy still remained inside the group. The mythology of the Texas 7, the fearless fugitives outrunning America, collapsed completely in that moment. One by one, the remaining fugitives surrendered. George Rivas emerged first, followed by the others under heavy police command. Officers forced them onto the snow-covered ground at gunpoint before placing them in handcuffs. Cameras captured every second of it. The footage spread across national television within hours. The infamous Texas 7 lying face down in the snow after weeks of fear and headlines. There was no dramatic last stand, no escape, no freedom, only exhausted men being dragged back into custody beneath flashing lights and television cameras. Nearby, reporters crowded against police barricades describing the end of one of the largest manhunts in modern Texas history. Across the country, viewers watched the arrests unfold live, while law enforcement agencies celebrated the capture. But for the Hawkins family, nothing about the moment felt victorious. Aubrey Hawkins was still dead. Christmas Eve could never be repaired. The surviving members of the Texas 7 were eventually transported back to Texas under extreme security, shackled heavily during transfers. They moved through airports, vehicles, and prison corridors surrounded by armed officers who had no intention of letting history repeat itself. Back inside Texas custody, the fugitives faced something even more final than prison: capital murder charges. And this time, the state intended to make sure none of them ever walked free again. When the surviving members of the Texas 7 were brought back to Texas, the state wasted no time building its cases against them. By then, the story had already grown beyond a normal murder trial. The prison escape alone had stunned the country. But the ambush killing of Officer Aubrey Hawkins transformed the case into something historic. 7 escaped convicts tied to the execution-style murder of a police officer on Christmas Eve. Texas intended to make an example out of all of them. The trials were separated, partly because prosecutors wanted juries to focus individually on each defendant's role in the crimes. But despite the separate courtrooms and different defense teams, one argument remained constant throughout nearly every proceeding. George Rivas was the leader. Prosecutors described him as the architect of the escape, the man who studied the prison routines, controlled the group, and kept the fugitives organized after they fled Connolly Unit. Witness testimony and evidence repeatedly painted the same picture. Wherever the Texas 7 went, Rivas sat at the center of it. Inside courtrooms, prosecutors displayed photographs from the Oshman's sporting goods robbery, crime scene images from the parking lot ambush, and surveillance evidence tied to the manhunt. Jurors listened as investigators reconstructed the final moments of Aubrey Hawkins' life. The lone officer arriving behind the store, the warning shouted by the lookout, the sudden eruption of gunfire from multiple positions. The details were devastating. 11 shots fired, no chance to defend himself, run over while the killers escaped. For Hawkins' family, the trials reopened the wound repeatedly. Lori Hawkins sat through testimony describing how her husband died, while their son waited for him to return to Christmas Eve dinner. Officers who had worked beside Aubrey attended proceedings in silence, many able to hide their anger whenever the escapees entered courtrooms wearing shackles and prison uniforms. Then came one of the strangest moments in the entire case. At one point during legal proceedings, George Rivas openly told the court he believed he deserved the death penalty. He spoke about accepting responsibility and even expressed a willingness to die for what happened. Some observers believed it was remorse. Others thought it was control, one final attempt to dominate the narrative surrounding him. But regardless of motivation, the outcome was inevitable. One after another, members of the Texas Seven received death sentences tied to the murder of Aubrey Hawkins. It became one of the largest death sentence outcomes connected to a single murder case in modern American history. Over the years that followed, the execution slowly began. Napoleon Beasley's execution had already kept Texas in the national spotlight around the same era. But the Texas Seven cases became something different entirely. A long-running symbol of violent escape, nationwide fear, and capital punishment unfolding across more than a decade. Larry Harper was already dead from suicide during the Colorado standoff. Then, in 2008, Michael Rodriguez became the first surviving member of the Texas Seven executed by the state of Texas. Others followed in later years as appeals failed one by one. Each execution brought the story back into headlines, briefly before fading again. But George Rivas remained the most infamous among them, the mastermind, the face most associated with the escape, the man many believed made freedom sound possible inside the Connolly unit. For years, he sat on death row inside the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas, while appeals slowly collapsed around him. The mythology surrounding the Texas Seven had long since faded by then. America had moved on to newer crimes, newer fears, newer headlines. But for the Hawkins family, time never fully moved forward. Every execution reopened the same Christmas Eve. Every court date revived the same parking lot. Every appeal delayed the same ending. Finally, after years of litigation, the state set George Rivas's execution date, February 29, 2012. Leap Day. The final chapter of the Texas Seven story had arrived. By the evening of February 29, 2012, the rain falling outside the Walls unit in Huntsville, Texas felt cold enough to cut through concrete. Inside the prison, George Rivas sat alone in a small holding cell. 11 years, his name had carried weight inside Texas. Now it was reduced to a number on an execution schedule. Earlier that day, Rivas received final visits from attorneys, spiritual advisors, and family members. Prison staff followed the same procedures they always followed before executions: controlled movements, medical checks, final paperwork, last meal arrangements. There was no drama left anymore, only routine. Rivas requested a final meal that included fried chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits, salad, cake, and sweet tea. Hours later, he sat beneath fluorescent lights eating his last meal while guards watched nearby in silence. Outside the prison walls, reporters gathered beneath umbrellas as cameras pointed toward the Huntsville unit entrance. Some journalists covering the execution had followed the Texas Seven story for years. They remembered the prison escape, the nationwide manhunt, America's most wanted broadcasts. and the Christmas Eve murder that changed everything. For the Hawkins family, the night carried no sense of victory. Aubrey Hawkins was still gone. His son had grown up without him. Nothing happening inside Huntsville could undo that parking lot behind Oshman Sporting Goods. Shortly before 6 p.m., prison staff escorted George Rivas into the execution chamber. Witnesses later described him as calm as officers, strapped him onto the gurney while IV lines were inserted into his arms beneath bright white lights. Then came the final statement. Rivas apologized directly to Aubrey Hawkins' family, expressing remorse for the pain caused by the murder. He also addressed his own family before looking toward spiritual advisors standing nearby. Minutes later, the lethal injection began. The drugs moved slowly through the IV tubing as witnesses watched through thick glass panels separating the chamber from observation rooms. Rivas took several deep breaths before his body gradually became still. At 6:22 p.m., George Rivas was pronounced dead. He was 41 years old, and with his execution, the mythology surrounding the Texas Seven finally collapsed completely. What once sounded almost unreal, 7 inmates escaping prison, outrunning authorities, becoming national fugitives, no longer resembled legend at all. In the end, the story was smaller, uglier, and far more tragic than the headlines ever made it seem. A police officer was murdered on Christmas Eve. A family lost a husband and father. 7 men destroyed what remained of their lives, chasing a freedom that lasted barely over a month. And inside the Walls unit, in Huntsville, Texas closed the final chapter exactly where the story was always going to end.